In 2014, a small independent band named Vulfpeck wanted to go on tour, but didn't have enough money. But by using a simple trick on Spotify, they managed to land themselves with $20,000 and threatened Spotify's entire business model. Vulfpeck are an indie funk band from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and are relatively well-known today. But back in 2014, they had a very modest following and had only roughly 1,600 followers on Twitter. They had a cult following, though, and, like many up-and-coming artists, were struggling to find ways to keep everything going in terms of cash flow and earnings. Jack Stratton, the leader of Vulfpeck, randomly came across an interview with the music producer Ron Fair, which sparked a light bulb moment. Stratton told Rolling Stone magazine, Fair produced Lady Marmalade and said it was only available on the soundtrack in stores. So people had to buy this $18 soundtrack to get this hit single. He goes, "That was a big win." I was like, wow, he's definitely working with the format in place. What does that look like now? And we started thinking about that. Ron Fair had found a way to use a clever trick to make more money off music. But when Vulfpeck were starting out in the early 2010s, the musical landscape looked very different. With fewer people buying physical copies of music, Bandcamp was and is an important platform for independent artists. On this platform, you could buy a digital copy of the album and 80% of the money goes directly to the artist or label. Vulfpeck found that roughly 1,000 people had bought their album on Bandcamp and provided them with an important revenue stream. But as an independent band, they found it difficult to tour. Without the financial backing of a label, tours had to be funded by themselves, and there were no guarantees that they would make their money back. What they needed was money upfront to fund a tour, and they decided that they could finance this tour by gaming music streaming services, in particular, Spotify. According to Stratton, we knew we wanted to tour because every day we get a request on our Facebook or Twitter to come to some town. And we had even been talking about a concept where people say, we're going to come to these cities, and if people buy enough tickets, we'll show up. So then simultaneously I was thinking, what is a Spotify exclusive album? What does that look like? So those two ideas converged. I posted the plan on Facebook and sent it to the band's email list, and it just spread naturally from there. We were kind of operating on the 1,000 fan hypothesis by Kevin Kelly, which you should check out, that this could definitely work if thousands of our fans do this and have Spotify. The plan was simple. They released a new album. The first song was called Z and consisted of just over 30 seconds of silence. The second track was called ZZ, which similarly consisted of over 30 seconds of silence. The whole album was nothing but complete and utter silence. It was an album that fans were encouraged to play on a loop while they went to sleep, and it was called Sleepify. If they did this, they could go on tour, and what's more, they could provide free admission for their fans. In the promo video for the album, Stratton says, here's how it works. Vulfpeck released Sleepify the album last week on Spotify. This album is different than our previous albums. This album is much quieter. In fact, we believe it's the most silent album ever recorded. A report from The Guardian did the math and said, so if a fan slept for 7 hours and streamed the album for the whole time, they'd play 840 tracks, generating $5.88 for Vulfpeck. If you can convince 100 fans to do the same, that works out at $588 per night royalties. And that's assuming each listener only has one playable device and only streams through the night. If they let it play all through the day, Vulfpeck's earnings could be more than tripled. You could, with willing fans, make a load of money from this scheme. 2 other tricks were used to make them more money. The reason why they got their fans to stream this album and not just their other albums on silent is because artists have tried this before, and Spotify recognizes when someone is doing this. But with Sleepify, you could play the album on full volume and still go to sleep. The songs also had to be just over 30 seconds long, which is enough time for Spotify to consider the song to have been properly streamed and pay the artist. Sleepify was, at first, an incredibly popular album. Stratton says, it's roughly 100,000 per track listens, so 1 million total, which is a big number. All these services pay about 2 months after the sale, so we'll know then, based on the rough calculations over 1 million streams, if it was half a cent, that would be $5,000. The band then acted as if this was a real album. They tweeted, please don't shuffle Sleepify. I know this might come off snobbish, but we spent a lot of time on track order. Spotify was put in a difficult situation, and their first reaction was to play it cool. Vulfpeck initially received an email from Spotify ambiguously asking if they needed help with anything. Then Spotify even saw the funny side. Spotify spokesperson Graham James said, This is a clever stunt, but we prefer Vulfpeck's earlier albums. Sleepify seems derivative of John Cage's work. However, James may have shot himself in the foot with this comment. John Cage was an experimental composer who released a song in 1952 called 433, which was 4 minutes and 33 seconds of complete silence. The song was, and continues to be, on Spotify's streaming services. With this in mind, it was difficult for Spotify to argue that these weren't real songs because there was no noise. The rock band Sonic Youth also released a song called Silence in 1995, which, as the name suggests, consisted of complete silence and is available on streaming platforms. The Sleepify album presented bad news for Spotify. Vulfpeck, a small funk band from Michigan, were now making headlines everywhere. Their story highlighted how difficult it was for musicians to make money and the problems with their streaming service model. There was also the danger of copycats. Vulfpeck were now featured on Billboard, and towards the end of the article it read, "Should Vulfpeck's brilliant stunt materialize into a completely free tour for fans, it could change the way independent artists regard streaming services and fan engagement. Just stream your favorite band's music or non-music while you sleep, and they could come to your city for absolutely free. This might just be the easiest way to support artists ever." Ultimately, Spotify had to put their foot down. If they didn't act now, their whole platform could be covered in silent albums. So a few weeks later, Spotify emailed Vulfpeck and demanded that they take down the album. Vulfpeck posted this on Facebook and said they apparently violated some of Spotify's terms. Vice magazine reported on this and could not get any response from Spotify as to what was happening. The article read, "We've tried numerous times to contact Spotify, but they've issued a no comment on every occasion, taking on the strategy of, let's not give this band any attention." But Vulfpeck was less inclined to go quietly. They released an EP of 3 songs called Official Statement, which contained the first track called #Hurt, where they explained that they were being asked to take down the album. The second track was Complete Silence, and the third track was just a random instrumental. Stratton also did an interview with Vice. When asked why Spotify asked him to take it down, he sarcastically said, "I think they panicked when they realized someone was actually making money from the music." He also said, "I haven't heard of any yet, but in the email asking us to take it down, they said they were receiving similar silent submissions." But the question is whether they would make any money from Sleepify. At the time of the interview, Sleepify had now been streamed 3.72 million times, which should have generated $18,000 for the band. When asked if Spotify would pay up, Stratton's response was, "My guess is they will. Spotify pays 2 months after the listen, so we'll know in May sometime." And despite the album being banned from Spotify, Vulfpeck were awarded $20,000 in earnings from the Sleepify album. They did free tours for fans in cities where the album was streamed the most, which were LA, San Francisco, Chicago, New York, and their hometown of Ann Arbor, Michigan. While Spotify looks like the bad guys in this particular story, there's a lot more to it than that. Stratton admitted in one interview that he's actually a big fan of Spotify and streaming services, but only as a user. He said, "As a user of the service, I'm a fan. I make a joke in the Sleepify video about how Spotify will throw in the history of recorded music if you sign up for Sleepify. As a band though, you have to be practicing yoga and eating grass-fed butter to face the coldness of the free market." Essentially, Spotify provides the artist or label with 70% of the earnings they make, so they take a minority of the money earned and not much less than Bandcamp. That being said, Stratton pointed out that it's not so much the rate of payment, but their entire business model that's the problem. In one interview, Stratton said, "If Whole Foods came out with a $10 a month subscription to food, it would be a popular product as well." A year later, Jay-Z released Tidal, which offered a slightly higher rate per stream for musicians. He told the New York Times, "The challenge is to get everyone to respect music again, to recognize its value. Water is free. Music is $6, but no one wants to pay for music. You should drink free water from the tap. It's a beautiful thing. And if you want to hear the most beautiful song, then support the artist." Taylor Swift, who had pulled her music from Spotify, gave a very simple thought process on why the Spotify model was problematic. She'd said, "Music is art, and art is important and rare. Important, rare things are valuable. Valuable things should be paid for. It's my opinion that music should not be free, and my prediction is that individual artists and their labels will someday decide what an album's price point is. I hope they don't underestimate themselves or undervalue their art." As we've seen since then, Taylor Swift and many others who had pulled their music have replaced their music and put it back up on streaming platforms. This tactic of releasing silent music has not been repeated since, effectively at least. but others have used the sleep trick. In 2020, Justin Bieber released the song Yummy, and both he and his fans wanted to do whatever it took to make it a #1 hit. Justin Bieber, or a person who was running his socials, reposted something from a fan which said, quote, "Justin really wants that #1 and he's really excited about it, as he said yesterday in his live stream. If you don't want to do any of this, it's totally fine. Just ignore the post. This is tips for the people who actually want to do an extra effort." The plan was to create a playlist with the song Yummy on it, then play it constantly while you sleep. As I mentioned before, Spotify has fraud detection measures in place, so you cannot play it on mute. So they suggested playing it at a low volume instead. Added to this, the fan encouraged Bieber fans based outside of the US to use a VPN and set their location to the US when playing the tracks. But despite their best efforts, they only reached #2 on the Billboard charts to the #1 song, Root the Box by Roddy Ricch. In 2023, the best way to support your favorite artists is not through tricks and gimmicks. It's through buying their music, attending live shows, or purchasing merchandise. Or, failing that, streaming their music or recommending them to your friends. Make sure to subscribe for more.